All right, part two of our necessarily very brief, truncated discussion of theater history for your intro to theater class. A few more of the very specific paragraphs, or a couple of paragraphs in the case of your book, chapters in the case of if you did a whole theater history book, and giant epoch making periods of theater history if you really wanted to go back and study them. A lot of people don't know the French playwright Moliere in the same way that they may know of William Shakespeare. In our country of the United States, almost everybody has heard of Shakespeare. Most people don't understand Shakespeare and don't watch a lot of Shakespeare and don't read a lot of Shakespeare, but almost everybody would recognize a picture of him, a cartoon of him. A lot of other countries that speak languages other than English, or at least aren't as dominated by English as our country, have their own great theatrical figure. In France, it's a guy called Moliere. In Germany, it's maybe Goethe. In Russia, it's probably Chekhov. In Spain, it's maybe Lope de Vega and Calderon. And there are all sorts of names in various Asian countries and cultures that are the Shakespeare of their country. One of the testaments to the enduring dominance of Shakespeare is that in a lot of those countries, if you said who's the greatest playwright of all time, they might say, oh, Moliere, but Shakespeare would still be number two, not Racine or Corneille or some other famous French playwright. Shakespeare has sort of pierced his way into lots and lots and lots and lots of cultures that weren't involved in his tradition or are not European at all. But Moliere and then the tragedy writers Corneille and Racine were the great playwrights of a French neoclassical period that is kind of equal to Shakespeare's England in terms of its importance and flowering of great, 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 great theater. And Moliere is one of my favorite playwrights to do. Just wonderful plays, quite different than other historical traditions, and a fascinating figure himself. You also have a chapter on Restoration England after the Civil War and interregnum that ended the sort of Elizabethan Shakespeare period, and its bringing about of different things that led to the theater of today. There's no chapter in your book, I believe, about the Italian Renaissance in theater, which is less important for the plays that are maybe not remembered so much, but more important for their enormous contributions to scenic design and scenic changing and the use of perspective to create realistic and impressive scenery. And also for opera, which is, of course, a direct ancestor of musical comedies, musicals of today. Opera, hugely important in the formation and the history of our performance tradition. I wonder if a single one of you gone to see a big grand opera performed in a big theater. It's pretty awesome. If you watch the movie Pretty Woman with Julia Roberts, you'll see how impressed she is with opera in San Francisco. I recommend it. It's certainly not for everyone. It's very much a niche art form now, but very important in our theater today because of how big musicals are. And that comes a lot out of the Italian Renaissance and various things in Germany as well. There is a section in your book about realism. We're talking only just about 150 years ago now that the concept of realism, of psychological truth, comes into theater. Various places around Europe, but usually attributed in great measure to Stanislavski in terms of acting in Moscow, in Russia, sorry, not Moscow, Russia, and Chekhov, the great playwright of Russian realism, but also Ibsen and Strindberg in the Scandinavian countries, we still do, when you talk about theater history and its importance, we still do a style of acting on movies and TV and still train people in a style of acting that comes directly from like 150, 125 years ago from Stanislavski. And then it spread out all over the world of acting. And no acting before that was similar. The kind of acting we do today is different than all other acting in the history of the world and the history of all sorts of traditions. So that's pretty interesting and fascinating. That doesn't mean that that acting was bad. It is just a different, more performative, more suggestive kind of acting. You do have a chapter in your book about modern theater. And then I wanted to point out there's a section on contemporary Black theater. This chapter, which you should read and engage with, is interesting in that it's this very brief chapter's attempt to grapple with how white, European, and male, I realize I'm a white European male as I'm saying this, how white, European, and male the teaching of theater history can sometimes feel. If you go from the Greeks to the Romans to medieval Europe to Shakespeare to Moliere to blah, 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 to Stanislavski and Chekhov, and up through modern times. And they say, there's a strong tradition of Black theater in this country. There has been a strong tradition of Black theater in this country since African Americans were allowed to do things. There was probably a strong tradition of Black theater country when almost every African American in the country were slaves. Only it was only seen probably by them gathered around performing for themselves. But since African Americans could perform for the public, there's been this strong and parallel but different tradition of theater. I lived in Louisiana for 10 years. I sometimes taught at Grambling, a historically Black university. And you could go see plays on the Chitlin circuit, which were basically plays still being performed. This is in the 90s and early 2000s, and there is some of this still today. Basically, all Black companies and players touring and performing plays around Black themes for mostly all Black audiences. This is still an important and vital thing, and well worthy of study, well worthy of thinking about. The history of theater is also history of Black theater, in the same way that the history of sports is really tied up in the history of when did various sports integrate Black people into them, in the United States at least. But the problem with the very short section on the history of Black theater is it's far too short, but it also ignores so many other things. Why is there no history of women's theater, of gay and lesbian theater, of Hispanic theater? And that's just in the United States. All those things have existed, but the whole world has theater histories, and then theater histories within theater histories, and beside theater histories. So I certainly do not begrudge. Let's include a chapter on Black theater, but it also kind of points out the sad fact of how many things get ignored, because for sort of some bad reasons and some understandable reasons. The understandable reasons are sort of, should we study historical things that didn't have a ton of impact? As you know, women have been marginalized historically in almost all societies, almost forever. So there are just not as many famous women generals or world leaders to study in history. You can argue, well, that's just a fact. It's not good that women have been marginalized, but it's just a fact. Or you can argue we need to go back into history and study what was the influence of women at those times, despite their marginalizations. And the exact same thing applies to theater. There are all kinds of theatrical traditions that we don't study very much. And one reason is no one copied them and turned them into the movies and TV of today. or they're no longer performed. There's nowhere to go see them, or no one has written great books about them. And both arguments apply. Well, that is somewhat of a reason to not know as much about them as things that have been gigantically influential. But it's also maybe a reason to go back and try to find these things. It's just driving me crazy that my glasses are so crooked. I don't know what is wrong today. My head is... sorry for the diversion. So that's a very important thing, I think, for you to think about in terms of theater history. What do we choose to study? Why do we choose to study it? A lot of the people who kind of decide why we choose to study things do so out of goodwill, trying to determine what are the things most important to understand, what are the things that really tell us important facts about who we are today and what has happened historically. But all those people were also biased. Everybody who's ever lived was biased. And that has to be taken into account as well. So when we think about theater history, and when you hear about it from someone like me, you're largely going to hear about the Western lineage. In one way, that makes a lot of sense. You are all in the United States, and you are all Americans of one stripe or another. For how long or how deeply, how do I know? But in one way, we're all the same, and we're all sort of studying our tradition. But in another way, we're all not the same at all. One of the great things about teaching at CRC, particularly when it's live and in person, is just the enormous diversity of backgrounds and heritages you have in any one class. People whose families at least came from all over the world, and people whose not only gender but religion and preferences and everything represent a wide variety of the human experience. And that's great and needs to be celebrated, but also needs to be grappled with in terms of our understanding of theater history as this kind of specific lineage that has come down to us from specific periods of time, which are not maybe as diverse in the world as they should be. Do you know about the Mahabharata, the great national epic theatrical tale of India? Do you know about the Japanese theatrical forms No, Bunraku, and Kabuki? You may have heard the word Kabuki. These are huge theatrical traditions all of their own, all deserving discussion. We have a chapter a little bit later on some of them. It's always important to keep that in mind. Okay, go read something about theater history, watch some videos. Thank you for letting me talk about it just a little bit. I appreciate it. Enjoy.